I want to try, because everyone we've met so far in South Korea has been so incredibly generous, so incredibly warm, friendly, and impressive in their ability to speak English. My Korean is not what it should be, but let me try and say hello. 좋은 아침이에요. Not bad, not bad. That's the extent. Apologies. First of all, I just really need to say thank you to Sangwei for the opportunity to be here. This is my first time in Asia. This is my first time in South Korea, but I very much hope it will not be my last time. I really like, there we go. I really like what you said, Sangwei, about reaching out and collaborating with people. It's the joy, it's one of the greatest joys of this job, and getting to travel the world and see new people and new cultures is absolutely wonderful. So thank you to everybody who's made our visit so pleasant. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about complex PTSD, give you a little bit of the history, where it is now, how we understand it. So before I do this, hands up, how many of you feel like you know what complex PTSD is? Really feel comfortable with it? Excellent. That is exactly my starting point. I was hoping that was the case, so we can go through this wonderfully well. Excellent. Okay, this story starts maybe around 1992. An American psychiatrist called Judith Herman published a book called Trauma and Recovery. An absolutely wonderful book. If anybody is ever interested in trauma, I'd highly recommend it. It's wonderful. Hopefully it's translated into Korean as well to make it a little bit easier. Judith Herman introduced this concept of complex PTSD. So up to that point, we were familiar with the disorder post-traumatic stress disorder. And she said, maybe there's another condition called complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which, as the name suggests, might be a little bit more complex than a standard PTSD. One of the things she did in her book and in her model was to make a distinction between what she called type 1 traumas and type 2 traumas. Type 1 traumas are single events. So a person has a car accident. A person experiences a natural disaster, an earthquake. These are catastrophic events that threaten a person's life and can precipitate or lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. But she was a clinician, and she saw many, many patients who had experienced ongoing traumas, chronic traumas, repeated traumas starting in early in life, childhood abuse, intimate partner violence. And she said, well, these are type 2 traumas. And maybe this kind of history of traumatic events, repeated, ongoing, prolonged, can give rise to a separate disorder, complex PTSD. So this was quite revolutionary at the time. She described in the book what complex PTSD looks like. She said, these are the classic hallmark symptoms. If you're in clinical practice and you meet somebody with type 2 traumas, these are the kind of things you'll see. You'll see that the person has experienced what she calls alterations, changes in ability to regulate emotions, changes in your experience of the world, your consciousness, somatic problems, unexplained physical symptoms, self-perception, how you view yourself, your perception of the perpetrator. So again, she's thinking here individuals who might have been abused by a spouse, parents or children who might have been abused by their parents, So changes in how people view these others in their life. Naturally then, relationships with other people, they might find it hard to trust other people and form connections with other people, and changes in their systems of meaning, their beliefs about the world, their faith in religion and God, whatever it might be, faith in themselves. All of these things can change. And she said, well, therapy was really about fixing all of these things, and that would be a long and difficult process. I think it's fair to say that Judith Herman's work was received very favorably by clinicians. I mean, still to this day, I meet clinicians who talk about this work and talk about this book, and they say it changed their practice. And I think it spoke to clinicians because people who go to therapy, people who seek out treatment, tend to be suffering quite a lot, and they tend to have a history of ongoing, repeated traumas. But interestingly enough, it didn't really have much of an effect on the scientific community. So psychological scientists, psychologists, I don't work with patients. I'm not a real psychologist. I can't treat anyone with any kind of health problems. I sit in an office and read books and write papers and call myself a psychologist, but I'm not really. People like us didn't really respond to it all that well. And there was a few problems from a scientific perspective. One of the big problems was, in those 7 symptoms that I showed you, it didn't include the core post-traumatic stress disorder problems, which we'll talk about in a second, but the reliving experiences, they weren't part of the description. There was a very, very large number of candidate symptoms. So she described all the different symptoms, more than 50 of them. Now imagine trying to meet a person and keep it in your head. Well, there might be 50, 55 symptoms that define this person's condition. That's difficult to work with. There was a lot of overlap with other disorders. So how do you know it's complex PTSD and not depression or some anxiety condition or somatic problem? There was actually very little evidence that all of these symptoms were uniquely produced by a history of chronic trauma. You could see them in people who just experienced a single traumatic event. Okay? So there were some problems. But I think Herman's model was very, very useful and influential to getting us where we are today for several reasons. It highlighted the role of chronic, repeated, and prolonged trauma. If you look at any of the diagnostic manuals, even today, other than the ICD-11, all of our descriptions of post-traumatic stress disorder are built on the assumption of a single catastrophic, overwhelming event. The assumption is person's life is going along okay, everything's going fine, and then out of nowhere, something terrible happens, and it changes their life. And Herman described beautifully that that's not always the case. Many people start life very early and experience lots and lots of trauma. It also opened the door to the possibility that there's another disorder separate from PTSD, qualitatively different disorder, something we call complex PTSD. So it wasn't perfect, but first efforts rarely are perfect. You should have seen my first slides that I sent saying, "Wait, they were not perfect," but they get better. Okay, so it's taken us to where we are today in ICD-11. We started working on this more than a decade ago. So the ICD-11 is developed by the World Health Organization. They put out their first proposals for this new model of post-traumatic stress in 2013. Mark and I were working together in Northern Ireland. We saw this. We were like, oh, this is interesting. Because they suggested 2 disorders, PTSD and complex PTSD. Did a lot of work on this. I'll talk about some of it. Mark will talk in a lot more depth about our work. Long story short, we built up an evidence base so that by 2019, the United Nations accepted the proposals for PTSD and complex PTSD. It was released in 2022, and now all United Nations member states are beginning the implementation process. So around the world, everyone will record, except America, because they've pulled out of the WHO now, are going to record these disorders according to the ICD-11. So what is the ICD-11 model of post-traumatic stress? Okay, first, it starts with trauma exposure, naturally. These are post-traumatic stress disorders. So it's a requirement. Anyone who's diagnosed with PTSD or complex PTSD must have experienced a traumatic event. Sounds like a simple question, doesn't it? Actually, it turns out it's incredibly tricky to figure that one out. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, the American Psychiatric Association published that. Kind of sits alongside the ICD-11. They provide different descriptions of what a traumatic event is. If you read the DSM, it says a traumatic event is any event that poses a direct threat to life or physical safety. Direct or indirect threat to physical safety, sexual integrity, or life. So it's narrow. But ICD-11 describes it much more broadly. Okay, it gives a much broader definition. It basically says any event or series of events, notice there it can acknowledge multiple traumas. So any event or series of event that provoke feelings of extreme threat or horror. So any event or series of events that provoke extreme threat or horror. That's broader. That leaves open the possibility that certain events that are not considered traumatic by the DSM can be considered traumatic under ICD-11. For example, stalking. You talk to some people who follow the DSM model and they say, stalking isn't a traumatic event because it's not a direct threat to life. But we know it can provoke symptoms of PTSD. What about emotional abuse? What about a child growing up whose parent tells them, you're nothing, you're terrible, continuously? Well, it's not a direct threat to life, is it? But we know it can provoke symptoms of PTSD and many other things. Consider, for example, somebody who suffers from psychosis and has a hallucination and thinks their life is in danger. Now, their life is not actually in danger, but they might respond to that psychotic experience with so much threat and horror that it could provoke a post-traumatic stress reaction. So ICD-11 is broader in terms of what it allows to be a traumatic event. And then it says, okay, once you're trauma exposed, you might have one of two conditions. You could have post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? So post-traumatic stress disorder in the ICD-11 is defined very narrowly. And Mark will talk more about this, so I won't labor this too much. But there are three sets of symptoms. Re-experiencing symptoms, but notice in the here and now. So it's not an intrusive memory. It's not a memory of, oh, remember that thing happened in the past. It's an intrusive memory where the person feels like it's happening again. Now that can be momentary, or it can be full-blown dissociative experience. It can happen when you're asleep in nightmares. It can happen when you're awake in flashbacks. Person might avoid any reminders of the trauma. They don't want to remember the people, places, things, thoughts, anything that reminds them of trauma. They just try and block it away. And then what we call a sense of current threat. So a sense that you're in danger. Think about this. If you relive a trauma, if it's happening again, you're going to feel like you're in danger right now. Yeah? So all your autonomic nervous system is ramped up. You're hyper-vigilant to threats. You're hyper-aroused. Okay? If you have symptoms in those three clusters, that's PTSD. Complex PTSD, though, involves these two separate sets of symptoms. So someone with complex PTSD has the core symptoms plus these additional symptoms. So these are referred to as persistent and pervasive problems. So these occur regularly. Inability to regulate emotions. So that's like what Judith Thurman talked about. A persistent and pervasive negative self-concept. So this profound view of the self as being a complete failure, a completely worthless person. And problems, persistent and pervasive problems in relationships. Now these are interesting because relationship difficulties can manifest many different ways. This is in terms of feeling disconnected from people. I think Thanos will talk a lot more about this. He's a clinician, he knows these people. But I think it's fair to say it's people who might want to connect to people. They want relationships, but they don't trust other people, and they feel disconnected and broken and detached from others, usually because of their trauma history. So they want relationships, but they can't get them. So if a person has all the PTSD symptoms in each of the three groups and the disturbances in self-organization symptoms, we call them DSO, if they have them in those three symptoms, that's complex PTSD. Okay? So PTSD, just these, complex PTSD, the full set. This makes two major predictions, this model. If we focus on the symptoms, if we go out into the population, as Sangwei and her team has done, and ask people about their symptoms of post-traumatic stress, what we should expect to see is that the symptoms group together in a particular way. They cluster together in terms of re-experiencing, avoidance, threat, and so on. And they ultimately represent these two general classes of symptoms, PTSD symptoms and these disturbances in self-organization symptoms. We can test that. It makes another prediction. If we focus on people, we should see separate groups, at least two groups. There might be one group who have all the PTSD symptoms, but not the other symptoms, not the additional symptoms. They're the PTSD patients. And then you'd see this separate group who have the PTSD and the DSO symptoms. Well, they're your complex PTSD groups. Again, that's a testable hypothesis. It looks like this. Again, this is just a graphical representation. This is how the symptoms cluster together. We can test this using a statistical method called factor analysis. And suffice to say, any configuration other than this falsifies the model. So it's testable and it's falsifiable. Then if we look at the people, let me just point this out because at first glance it probably doesn't look very good. If you look along the x-axis, there's all the symptoms. The y-axis represents your probability of having a symptom, 0 to 1. Okay, so on the bottom you have the gray line. These are people who don't have any of the symptoms. Experience a trauma, but you're absolutely fine. Okay, the blue line up there, they're people who might have a high probability of all of the symptoms. Okay, that's your complex PTSD group. And then the orange line, they would be the people with a high probability of the PTSD symptoms and a low probability of the DSO symptoms. If you saw another configuration, imagine that orange line, if you, in your mind's eye, if it was just running parallel to the blue line but lower. Well, that would say all the symptoms cluster together, they're always hang together, just at different levels of severity. That would falsify the prediction of different groups. Okay. I can't spend a lot of time going through all the evidence, but we have dozens and dozens and dozens of studies from all over the world with different population groups that basically support those two predictions. I think Mark will talk a bit more about this, but a few years ago, one of our colleagues in Ulster, Enya Redican, led a project where she reviewed all the studies that have been published to date, and we found a tremendous amount of support for these predictions. So, what we can say is that, why has the ICD-11 model caught on? If you do a Google search and see how many people have published papers on complex PTSD in the last 3 years, it's more than all the studies since 1992. So researchers have caught on to it, clinicians have caught on to it, the empirical evidence supports it. So why? Well, one of our brilliant colleagues from University College London, Chris Bruin, wrote about this a few years ago, and he identified several reasons. He said, well, the ICD-11 model of complex PTSD requires the PTSD symptoms, where Herman's model didn't. To have complex PTSD, you must have the core PTSD symptoms. So it's a part of the disorder. It has a small number of symptoms. Rather than the 50 or so symptoms, there's just 12. So it's easier to understand. Importantly, the diagnosis is based on the symptoms that the person presents, not the trauma history. So remember, Herman talked about type 1 and type 2 traumas. And that was what defined whether you had PTSD or CPTSD. Not now. A person could have complex PTSD if they experience a single trauma, if they have a car accident. A person can experience childhood trauma repeatedly throughout their life as they develop, and they can be diagnosed with PTSD rather than complex PTSD. And then functional impairment, just like every other psychiatric disorder. So the person not only has to have the symptoms, but their life has to be affected by them in order to achieve a diagnosis. Okay. You will warn me if I'm approaching the end of my time. Hopefully I've lost track of where I am. I don't want to intrude on Mark's time. So that's a little bit about the history, where it started, where it is now, and I want to finish off maybe by just talking to you a little bit about our current work, where we're trying to understand or explain why complex PTSD has developed. So a couple of years ago, Mark, Chris Bruin, and myself, we wrote and published a paper called The Memory and Identity Theory of Complex PTSD, published it in Psychological Review. We lay out the whole thing. If anybody's suffering from insomnia, this paper is freely available. It's open access. I'd really recommend it. Some of us are struggling to sleep now with the jet lag. Tonight, if I can't sleep, I'm going to open this paper, read it, and But it is open access. You can read it if you wish, but I'll try and give you some idea about it. All right. Why a theory? Why do we need a new theory? We had theories of PTSD. Well, we thought there were a few questions that we needed to answer, two in particular. If you think about it, before ICD-11 came along, PTSD was just a single disorder, all the symptoms listed together. Then ICD-11 came along and said, but hang on, the PTSD symptoms and the disturbances in self-organization symptoms, they're separate, okay? And we have empirical evidence, as I showed you, that yes, they can exist independently. So it suggests if these two things are separate and can exist independently, there must be separate causal pathways that produce or lead to these symptoms. So existing theories of PTSD had no need to explain that distinction. We felt that was a question that needed to be answered. So one of the questions we wanted to answer was, what are the mechanisms that give rise to the PTSD symptoms, and then also the other separate DSO symptoms that define complex PTSD? There was a second one. As I've said a couple of times, most, with the exception of Judith Thurman, all the models and theories of PTSD are based on the notion of a single overwhelming event. But ICD-11 now recognizes and places a special focus on repeated, chronic, multiple forms of trauma. And notices that there are different outcomes. So like I said, multiple trauma, chronic trauma, ongoing trauma, whatever you will, this is a risk factor for complex PTSD. We do expect people with such a history to be more likely to develop complex PTSD. But, as I said, people with that history can develop PTSD. And somebody who experiences a single traumatic event later in life, like a car accident, can develop complex PTSD. We see this, we observe it. So, why can PTSD and complex PTSD occur following different types of trauma? We wanted to answer that. Our theory is called the memory and identity theory of complex PTSD. Naturally, the foundations of the theory are on memory and identity problems. This is nothing revolutionary. You know, memory problems, identity problems have long been recognized as causal factors in the development of PTSD. So we weren't introducing anything new. We were just trying to use these causal mechanisms to answer these two questions. All right. That can be a bit overwhelming. This is our theory. Let me see if I can explain it to you. Okay. Over here on the right-hand side, they're just our symptoms of complex PTSD. Yeah? We've got our PTSD symptoms and our DSO symptoms. Okay, that's good. Let's go over to the left-hand side and think about trauma exposure. Trauma exposure is where it all starts. Now, we recognize that trauma can vary in terms of risk. Okay? Some traumas can be more damaging than others. They can increase your risk of complex PTSD. So as you see on the board, interpersonal traumas might be worse than non-interpersonal traumas. You know, so being physically assaulted is probably a greater risk factor. Actually, it is. We know. We have the empirical evidence. It's a greater risk factor than, say, having a car accident. Okay. Trauma that occurs in early life is probably riskier, more risky than trauma that happens in later life. Multiple forms of trauma, probably more risky than single forms of trauma. But we can also think about what happens at the moment of the trauma. If the person reacts with extreme emotions, if they have a panic attack at the moment of the trauma, if they dissociate, if they have an overwhelming cognitive response, if they freeze, this can increase risk of complex PTSD. So think about trauma on a continuum and somewhere falling on the risk. But trauma doesn't just happen in isolation, does it? Trauma occurs to a person. And people can vary in their vulnerability to trauma. So let's imagine a scenario. Let's imagine something terrible happens out in the environment. Two people are exposed to a traumatic event, a catastrophic event, terrorist attack. One person has a history of mental health problems. Maybe in the past they suffered from depression or anxiety. Maybe this person is socially isolated. They go home after the trauma and they have no one to engage with. They have no significant other, no family members, very few friends to lean on. They might have a whole lot of stressors in their life. Financial stressors, work stressors, living stressors. The other person, on the other hand, experiences trauma, but they go home and they have a loving husband or wife, they have a family support network, they have a community that they can rely on, they have access to good health care. These are not equal individuals. So, imagine a scenario where a person experiences a high-risk trauma, let's say an intimate partner violence, they're in a relationship, but they have a huge support network, okay? They might be at a high risk in terms of their trauma, but a low-risk, resilient individual. That might mean they might develop the core PTSD symptoms, they might have some re-experiencing, but they might be protected against all the other experiences. And therefore, after a type 2 trauma, a high-risk trauma, they might only develop PTSD. But imagine somebody who has a high-risk trauma and is highly vulnerable. Well, that person's going to be at a high risk of developing PTSD, or complex PTSD, excuse me. Then again, imagine the person who experiences a low-risk trauma, maybe they're over here, low-risk trauma, car accident later in life, single event. But they are very high risk. They have a history of trauma, adversity, mistreatment, you name it, they've had a terrible life. Well, the interaction between a traumatic event and all of this underlying vulnerability could give rise to the full spectrum of complex PTSD symptoms. So then we move on to the core theoretical features, which are the traumatic memories and the negative identities. Let me see if I can explain. Okay, traumatic memories. Traumatic memory. PTSD, complex PTSD, is a disorder of memory. If you take nothing else away from this talk, it's a disorder of how memory functions. I'd like you to try and remember one of the most pleasant experiences you've ever had. Okay? Maybe it's the birth of your child, maybe it's getting married, best concert you've ever been to. Highlight memory. Try and bring it to mind. Can you do it? Okay. Probably, chances are, if you do it enough, first thing to notice is you can bring it to mind. Second thing to notice is you'll probably have some feeling, some experience. Oh yeah, remember that. Yeah, that was amazing. And the third thing is you'll probably remember it happened back then, it happened somewhere else, and that was the space in which it occurred. Right? That's normal autobiographical memory. And what happens is, let's say there's a part of the brain called the amygdala that processes all of the emotional experiences. So during a wonderful event, amygdala processes that event, all the pleasant feelings or negative feelings are encoded. The hippocampus sits right next to the amygdala. It processes all the contextual information. It's happening here, it's happening now, it's happening in this space. They all talk to each other, they all get embedded, it all functions beautifully in normal autobiographical memory. You can call it to mind, you can remember it. Okay. That doesn't happen in a traumatic event. In a traumatic event, remember what it is: extreme threat or horror. What happens then? Well, your system becomes flooded with cortisone, norepinephrine, all of the stress hormones. Well, what does that do? That ramps up the amygdala so that all of the emotional experiences, the threat and horror, are coded very, very clearly. But those hormones tend to downregulate the hippocampus. So all the contextual information, the time, the place, the space, that isn't there, or it's there very imperfectly. And it doesn't really communicate to one another. So it's not embedded in autobiographical memory. So if you say to somebody who's experienced a traumatic event, try and bring it back to mind right now, just like I asked you to do it, they'll find it very, very difficult to do it. It tends to get triggered by an external cue. And when it gets triggered, well, what happens, what comes back is all the strongly felt emotions and physical sensations, but none of the contextual information. So you feel like it's happening again right here, right now. That's why you get that sense of here and now quality to it. So they're your traumatic memories, and as the model suggests, they are the sole cause of the reliving in the here and now symptoms. That's it. But they also play a role in all the PTSD symptoms and some of the disturbances in self-organization symptoms. Then you have negative identities. Okay? I won't labor this point too much. I think it's fairly self-explanatory. Bad events that happen to you can change how you think about yourself. Yeah? Imagine an individual who grows up, who thinks they're strong and they're capable and they can face any challenge. And then they're walking down the street, everything's going well, and somebody out of nowhere, for no particular reason, just attacks them and beats them up and leaves them for dead. Well, that person might come to view themselves very differently. They might come to have an experience of themselves that they're no longer strong and capable. They're vulnerable. I can't do anything. I'm helpless. Now imagine an individual who grows up in an environment from day one they're mistreated. They're told they're terrible. They're abused by their parents, the people they're biologically programmed to trust the most. So they feel disconnected from other people, alienated, betrayed, abandoned. In really extreme cases, people will say who've experienced this kind of trauma, I don't even feel like a real person. I feel broken, shattered. I'm one person in one situation, I'm another person in another situation. Their whole sense of self is just utterly broken. Right? And these two things can interact. People can feel very ashamed of themselves for having these traumatic memories. Why can't I control them? What's wrong with me? There's something fundamentally broken with me. I'm inferior, I'm worthless. So ultimately, the model says that trauma exposure can occur. It occurs to a person. These two things interact with one another to ultimately give rise to the development of these traumatic memories, sense of self, beliefs about the self, a sense of identity, and then they provoke and give rise to the complex PTSD symptoms. Now, I'm going to have to wrap up in a couple of minutes, so I figured I might not have gotten to this. We've done some studies. We're beginning to empirically test this model. So it's a model, it's a framework, it's a way of describing it. It makes testable predictions. And we've done some work both in the United Kingdom and Ukraine, and we've tested these ideas. We've tested these predictions. Do traumatic events give rise in the way that the model explains it? Well, yeah, what we find is that folks who've experienced interpersonal traumas rather than non-interpersonal traumas, they're more likely to develop these traumatic memories and negative identities. People who've experienced trauma early in life, in childhood, are more likely to develop these negative identities than individuals who experience trauma later in life, in adulthood. And multiple traumas is a big factor. People who've experienced lots of different traumas, they have lots of these memory problems and lots of these identity problems. We've also tested these relationships, the predictive relationships between traumatic memories and the symptoms. What we find is generally they are as predicted. These traumatic memories predict the development of the re-experiencing symptoms as we expect, but they also predict all the other symptoms. So traumatic memories are so important. And then we see that specific negative identities predict specific kinds of complex PTSD symptoms. All in fairly interesting ways, but sure, we can talk about it another time. You'll have to bring me back and we'll go through that. All right, so just to wrap up, complex PTSD, as it's described in ICD-11, I think is a very highly researched condition. You'll see when Mark tells you about the development of it that we have a kind of very strong theoretical basis to support the construct validity. We now have a theory to understand it and explain why it arises. That allows us to do some hopefully interesting research to better understand the mechanisms that drive this disorder. And we try and make all of the materials needed to test all of this work freely available. So we have a website here. It's snappily titled Trauma Measures Global Who came up with that title? Yeah, we bought that domain name, and every time I just think, oh my God, we have to change it. But on our website, we give away all the materials. We make all the materials freely available. So Sangway will have to get the Korean versions at some point and put them up on the website. So I invite anyone who's here, who's interested in this type of work, to think about whether or not they want to test the theory. Anyone watching on YouTube who wants to do this work is most welcome. And I wish you well in testing this theory and looking at complex PTSD. All right, folks, thank you very much for listening. I hope that was useful.